Iran Daily Briefing. Sunday, March 29, 2026. Iran struck Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, a U.S. military installation, wounding American service members in a direct strike on a U.S. military facility. The casualty count varies by source. France 24 reports a dozen wounded, while NPR puts the number at 15. We'll use the range throughout this episode. At least 12 and as many as 15, with 2 described as seriously injured. That strike is the top story today, but it does not stand alone. In the past 24 hours, 2 explosions hit northern Tehran, Houthi forces launched back-to-back missile strikes toward Israel, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed attacks on industrial facilities in the UAE and Bahrain. Today's briefing maps all of it. To understand today's news, you need to understand the shape of this conflict. Iran has struck targets in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE and Bahrain. Houthi forces, the Iran-backed movement in Yemen, have launched missiles toward Israel. Israeli strikes have hit Iran directly, including a pre-dawn strike on a residential building in southern Tehran that France 24 reports killed at least 5 children. The conflict has pulled in regional actors on multiple sides. If the February 28 start date reported by Al Jazeera is accurate, the conflict is now in its 4th week, though that date comes from a single source and has not been independently confirmed in our intel. What is confirmed is this: the geographic footprint of the fighting is wide, the diplomatic track is active but fragile, and today the conflict produced its clearest direct contact with American forces yet. Here is what we are covering today. The Prince Sultan strike. What happened, what was hit, and what Washington has and has not said publicly. Diplomatic talks in Islamabad that may represent the most serious mediation effort so far. Iranian, the IRGC strikes on Gulf industrial facilities. The Houthi missile campaign against Israel. Protests inside Israel, and a look at what the next 48 hours may bring. The strike on Prince Sultan Air Base. Prince Sultan Air Base sits roughly 80 kilometers southeast of Riyadh. It is one of the most significant U.S. military installations in the Middle East, a staging hub for air operations across the region. On Saturday, Iran struck it. France 24 reports the attack involved at least 1 missile and several drones, causing damage to multiple U.S. refueling aircraft. Refueling aircraft, the tanker planes that extend the range and loiter time of strike jets, are a critical node in sustained air campaign operations. Damage to those assets has operational consequences beyond the aircraft themselves. On casualties, France 24 reports 12 wounded, including 2 serious injuries and 10 concussions. NPR reports 15 wounded. The 2 NPR reports are separate items based on the same sourcing. We cannot reconcile those figures from today's intel, so we are holding the range, at least 12, as many as 15. We have no reporting of Tehran issuing a public claim of responsibility for the Prince Sultan strike. That is notable. Iranian strikes on Gulf infrastructure and on US-linked targets earlier in this conflict were claimed publicly by the IRGC. The absence of a claim here may reflect deliberate ambiguity, Iran creating space for deniability while still demonstrating capability. Or it may reflect that a claim has been made through channels not yet captured in today's reporting. We do not know which. Washington's public posture, as of this morning, remains careful. The USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship carrying approximately 3,500 Marines, has arrived in the Middle East, according to France 24. The deployment of a ship of this type brings a ground-capable force into the theater. That deployment was publicly reported. Its purpose has not been publicly characterized by US officials. Reza Pahlavi, the Iranian opposition figure and son of the late Shah, spoke at CPAC in Grapevine, Texas on Saturday. He called on the Trump administration to, in his words, stay the course. Pahlavi holds no elected office, but his appearance at a major conservative political conference signals that the domestic US political environment around this conflict is being actively managed. Here is the specific thing to watch. If and when the US government makes a formal public statement on the Prince Sultan attack, listen for whether that statement uses language of attribution or announces any response action. That would mark the first formal US public attribution of the attack. Story 1. Diplomacy in Islamabad. While military operations have dominated the headlines, a parallel diplomatic track is running, and today it produced its most concrete development yet. Foreign ministers from Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt and Saudi Arabia met in Islamabad on Saturday to discuss ending the conflict. Al Jazeera reports Pakistan is acting as the primary mediator between Washington and Tehran, and that Pakistan separately secured a deal with Iran, allowing 20 ships through the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz matters enormously here. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. Any disruption or any agreement to keep it open has immediate economic consequences far beyond the immediate parties. Pakistan's mediating role is significant for a structural reason. Islamabad is not a party to the conflict, maintains diplomatic relations with Tehran, and has leverage with Washington as a nuclear-armed state and long-time, if complicated, US partner. The four-minister format, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, also represents a coalition that spans Sunni Arab states, a majority Muslim democracy with regional ambitions, and NATO's only Muslim majority member. The watch item here: whether these talks produce any agreed framework, and whether either Washington or Tehran publicly acknowledges Pakistan's mediating role. Neither has done so on the record in today's reporting. Story 2. Strikes on Gulf. Industrial facilities. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the branch of Iran's military that operates separately from the regular armed forces and reports directly to Supreme Leader Khamenei, claimed responsibility on Saturday for strikes on two major industrial facilities. The targets, Aluminium Bahrain, known as Alba, and Emirates Global Aluminium in the UAE. The IRGC stated explicitly that these attacks were in retaliation for US-Israeli strikes on Iranian infrastructure. That framing matters. It positions the Gulf states not as neutral parties but as legitimate targets because they host or are perceived to host infrastructure that enables strikes on Iran. For Bahrain and the UAE, that logic is a direct challenge to their security calculus. Both countries have deepened ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords, the 2020 normalization agreements. Both host US military infrastructure. Iran is now signaling that those relationships have costs. Watch for whether Bahrain or the UAE respond publicly, either with condemnation of Iran, a formal request for US defensive support, or a recalibration of their public posture toward the conflict. Story 3. The Ukraine-UAE Defense Cooperation Agreement. One development from the past 24 hours that has received less attention than it deserves. Ukraine and the United Arab Emirates announced a defense cooperation agreement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced the deal. Ukraine and the UAE announced the cooperation agreement amid ongoing Iranian drone strikes in the region. Ukraine has extensive operational experience with Iranian-made drones, specifically the Shahed series, which Russia has used extensively in its war against Ukraine. That experience is directly relevant to the UAE's current threat environment. What this agreement includes in practice has not been detailed in today's reporting, but the timing and the context place it squarely within the landscape of this conflict. Watch for whether the cooperation agreement produces any concrete capability transfer, training, technical intelligence on drone countermeasures, or shared air defense data. Story 4. The Houthi missile campaign. Houthi forces, the Iran-backed armed movement that controls much of northern Yemen, launched their first missile toward Israel since the conflict began on Saturday. That was followed by a second strike within 24 hours, according to Houthi military spokesperson Yahya Sari, who announced the second attack in a televised speech on March 28. Israel's military said it intercepted the first missile. NPR also reports an interception. The second attack, per Sari, involved both missiles and drones. The Houthi re-entry into this conflict is significant for a specific reason. During the Gaza war, Houthi missile and drone campaigns toward Israel became a persistent, low-grade pressure, not militarily decisive, but operationally significant and diplomatically complicated. The resumption of that campaign in the context of this conflict reopens that front. The watch item: whether Israel responds directly against Houthi targets in Yemen, and whether the US, which conducted its own strikes against Houthi infrastructure earlier this year, coordinates any response. Story 5. Strikes on Tehran and southern Iran. Two powerful explosions struck northern Tehran early Sunday morning, according to France 24. No further detail on those strikes was available at time of production. Separately, Iran's Fars news agency, which is state-aligned, reported that a strike on a pier in Bandar Kamir, in the southern province of Hormozgan on the Persian Gulf coast, killed 5 people and wounded 4 others. Middle East Eye carries the same report. Bandar Kamir is a port town in Hormozgan province, geographically significant because Hormozgan borders the Strait of Hormuz. A strike on port infrastructure in that province, if confirmed, would represent targeting of the maritime corridor that is simultaneously being discussed in diplomatic talks in Islamabad. France 24 also reports that a pre-dawn Israeli strike hit a residential building in southern Tehran, killing at least 5 children. The Iranian Red Crescent, according to Al Jazeera, rescued a toddler from rubble following a US-Israeli strike. These are the human costs of a conflict now in its 4th week. Costs that are accumulating on the Iranian civilian side in ways that will shape both domestic Iranian politics and international opinion. Watch for any Iranian government response to the civilian casualty reporting, either domestic political statements or outward-facing statements aimed at international audiences. Story 6. Protests inside Israel. 21 people were arrested in Tel Aviv and Haifa during protests against the war, according to the Times of Israel and Middle East Eye. Anti-war protest activity inside Israel has been a consistent feature of this conflict. The arrests indicate that demonstrations are continuing and that authorities are responding with enforcement action. Watch for whether the protest movement grows in scale or begins to attract political figures willing to associate publicly with anti-war positions. We opened this morning with the strike on Prince Sultan Air Base, a direct Iranian attack on a US military installation that wounded American service members. Now that you have the full context, here is what makes that development significant beyond the immediate casualty count. Prince Sultan hosts refueling aircraft. Those aircraft are essential to sustained US air operations over Iranian territory. Damage to them is not merely symbolic, it affects operational capacity. The strike combined missile and drone delivery, which presents a more complex interception challenge than a single vector attack. The USS Tripoli's arrival in the region, 3,500 Marines aboard a ship designed for amphibious operations, follows that strike. Analyst Kenneth Katzman has raised the possibility that US war objectives which cannot be met with air power alone could require ground forces, and has specifically noted that opening the Strait of Hormuz would require ground troops. The Washington Post has reported that Pentagon planning for ground operations exists, potentially involving special operations and conventional infantry. No decision to activate those plans has been publicly announced. Taken together, the Prince Sultan strike, the Tripoli deployment, and the reported Pentagon planning do not tell us where this conflict is going. But they tell us that the range of possible next steps is wider than it was a week ago. Analyst Kenneth Katzman has raised the possibility of a ground phase. The Washington Post has reported that planning exists. No public decision has been announced. Here is what to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. On the military track, listen for any formal US government statement on the Prince Sultan attack. Specifically, watch for whether any official statement uses language of attribution or announces a response action. That would mark the first formal US public attribution of the strike. Watch for whether additional details emerge on the Sunday morning explosions in northern Tehran, their source, their targets, and whether either Israel or the US acknowledges them. Watch for any Israeli response to the Houthi missile strikes. Israel has the capability to strike Houthi targets in Yemen and has done so before. A response or a deliberate decision not to respond both carry strategic signals. On the diplomatic track, the Islamabad talks represent the most structured multilateral diplomatic effort we have reporting on. Watch for any joint statement from the four foreign ministers, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and specifically for any language on a ceasefire framework or a humanitarian corridor. Watch for whether Pakistan's role as mediator receives any public acknowledgement from Washington or Tehran. Silence on that point is itself a data point. On the economic track, the Hormuz shipping deal between Pakistan and Iran, 20 ships cleared to pass, is the first reported agreement of this kind since the conflict began. Watch for whether other countries seek similar arrangements and whether Iran uses access to the strait as a negotiating instrument in the broader diplomatic process. On the ground phase, question. The Washington Post's reporting on Pentagon ground operation plans has not been officially confirmed or denied. Watch for any Pentagon briefing or congressional testimony that addresses the question directly. Any official acknowledgement or explicit denial will be significant. Today's episode covered a direct Iranian strike on a US military installation in Saudi Arabia, back-to-back Houthi missile launches toward Israel, the IRGC attacks on Gulf industrial targets, diplomatic talks in Islamabad, and the widening civilian toll inside Iran. Each of those developments is significant on its own. Together, they describe a conflict that is active across multiple fronts simultaneously: military, diplomatic, and economic. Tomorrow, we will follow the US government's response to the Prince Sultan attack, any developments out of Islamabad, and whether the Houthi missile campaign against Israel draws a direct response. We will also be watching for any official US statement on the USS Tripoli deployment and its intended role. If you found today's briefing valuable, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes every morning.